Remnants of a Forgotten Past by Albin55, Chapter 1, Amber. In the barren crater that was once a proud civilization, there stood one monument to the past. 10 years after the return of Madara, 10 years since the ninja world was leveled by the Fourth Great Ninja World War and the raging madman who could never have his plans realized. 13 years since that failsafe ruined Akatsuki's plan. 13 years since they had ruined centuries of careful planning and warring. It had unwittingly ruined the shinobi world, but the Biju would preserve their future even as they and their host lay dormant, no matter how long they had to be in there, in the place where even Kaguya could not touch them. Not that she was around. The failsafe had ruined any chances of her ever being revived. Their thought process was to better to be safe than sorry. Even they wouldn't be able to reverse it once the die was cast, for they too would be put into a state of hibernation. They had agreed to make it as strong as possible in the hopes that it would last until the Katsuki organization had folded, and even Kaguya's immortality life had wilted inside the moon. If that cost them the shinobi world and their hosts, their friends and family, then so be it. What the new world was like and what prolonged exposure to it would do to their hosts, the Biju had no idea. They had promised back during their creation, if the situation got this bad, they would take countermeasures of their own accord without any regard or consultation from the sage. So, when the Akatsuki revealed themselves to the world and began to take action, the Biju instantly knew the motives behind that organization and telepathically coordinated their plan. When Itachi and Kisame went for Naruto in that hotel, Kurama knew it was time to begin coordinating in secret with the others. They put their plan into action simultaneously before the Akatsuki could make any more moves and without any consultation from their jinchuriki. For Naruto and Kurama, it was some months into Naruto's absence from Konoha during his trip with the Toad Sage Jiraiya. The master and apprentice had been staying at a hot spring town where Naruto would train and Jiraiya would work on his latest novel. One morning, at the hotel they were staying at, Jiraiya woke up to a rude surprise after spending the majority of the night passed out from a day's worth of endeavors. Tugged out from his own training, Naruto was still perched in the position in which he had gone to sleep, clad in his orange jumpsuit and on top of his sleeping bag. It would have been normal, except Naruto was encased in a layer upon layer of what appeared to be solid red-orange chakra. Like a pupa about to undergo metamorphosis, the dormant genin could be seen underneath the slightest transparent nature of the chrysalis. But when Jiraiya saw him for the first time, he stumbled backwards in shock, tripped over his own belongings and hitting the wall with a thud. The boy was encased in a cocoon of chakra, appearing presumably overnight. It was a jutsu Jiraiya had never seen before in his life, if it even was a jutsu. Within the shell, Naruto looked asleep and peaceful, completely unaware of what was transparent all around him. One would be forgiven for wondering if he was even alive. Hundreds of miles away in the Kaze no Kuni, the two older sand siblings would wake to a similar sight to what was occurring in the hot spring tower. They would see their brother Gaara encased in his own sandy yellow cocoon of solid chakra, appearing to be asleep for the first time in his life. He was in the exact same predicament as Naruto. Naruto's training trip was cancelled when the jinchuriki stayed in that state for an infinite period of time. He did not awaken from within his capsule, nor did the surrounding chrysalis ever budge. Our Rasengan tentatively applied to the edge of the cocoon was ineffective in even chipping some of it off, and any other jutsu Jiraiya tried to break through it didn't make it budge. The crystallized Naruto was brought back to Konoha at the befuddlement of Tsunade. Tirelessly, she worked hard with the best medical scientists and jutsu specialists in an attempt to crack this case, literally and figuratively. Ninjutsu, taijutsu, genjutsu, failure. The highest form of sealing and unsealing as transcribed by Jiraiya, failure. The best medical ninjutsu supervised by the world's leading medic nin, failure. They had never seen anything like it, and no procedure came close to solving the mystery. They couldn't even scrape off any sample of the cocoon to test it. While Naruto remained in the basement of the hospital under heavy guard, an increasingly desperate Tsunade began to contact other villages, pleading with other leaders to lend their aid and help research this problem. Her mouth went dry when she heard the news about the other villages having problems with their own jinchuriki in the exact same situation. Crystals of chakra that harbored the jinchuriki, who appeared to be sleeping, every last one of them. They were about to contact her for the same exact thing. Eventually, Akatsuki completed its preparations and began hunting the 9 Biju. Imagine their surprises when they came for Naruto again and found him in the state he was. They captured him beneath the watchful eye of Konoha and brought him back to one of their bases. They tried unsealing the Biju using their planned methods. To no avail. They tried their own techniques to no avail. Toby and Pain reportedly threw a hissy fit for weeks after the fact. Eventually, Konoha took Naruto back in the rescue mission of a lifetime, but failure after failure piled up. The chrysalis was utterly, completely, and totally indestructible. The Fourth Great Shinobi War happened not too long afterwards, and the ninja world became history because of it. The ninja world fell into shambles. People in the aftermath slowly gave up on the idea of a ninja both as a mercenary and a soldier under a flag, with the daimyo of the nations disbanded the hidden villages after not finding it worthwhile to rebuild. The war had also led to so many casualties that there was a lack of survivors to pass ninja techniques on to the next generation, with each ensuing one using them less and less before they faded out completely. Konoha had been leveled in the war and became ruins. Where the hospital once sat, however, there was the crystallized cocoon with what appeared to be a young boy trapped inside, his eyes closed as though sleeping. For centuries, he stood as the single monument and object intact in the ruins of Konoha, until the day came when erosion and weather catastrophe would end up burying the boy and the rest of the ruins deep within the earth. The Biju understood their own ability. The cocoon would hold, and Naruto and the other jinchuriki would lay dormant for eons as the ages followed by. The cocoon would survive several thousands of times longer than the Biju had anticipated. Civilization would rise and fall, their durations and peaks flowing by as mere seconds on the geological timescale. Eventually, the human race as the world knew it became extinct, while the jinchuriki were preserved, only for a near-identical species from the genus Homo to evolve again from dust. The chakra chrysalis would end up holding for over 100 million years. All within that time frame, humanity would have gone extinct only to evolve again, and the moon would shatter into pieces. Kaguya's immortal life would have been shot off into the depths of space in the ensuing cataclysm, and continental shift and climate change would alter the terrain and landscape interestingly into a world completely unlike the old one. The border of Vacuo and Veil. When the leaders from centuries ago were drawing up borders, they must have been looking at simple geographical differences, while Atlas and Mistral were on separate continents and thus had natural borders with the ocean. Vacuo and Veil were on the same continent and thus had to fight like siblings over whose territory was what. Vacuo, being the red-headed stepchild of Remnant's kingdoms, was left with miles and miles of useless desert, while Veil drew its border right at the point where the desert began to turn into lush forest and natural resources. The border town around the region were home to shady characters and illegal establishments, far away from the watchful eye of either kingdom's metropolitan areas. Crime ran rampant, and anyone who was brave or foolhardy enough to make the border desert their home had to be strong and resilient, or became a victim. On a more positive note, this desert and Vacuo in general was home to some of the oldest known archaeological sites in the world, not to mention its extensive fossil record. It was an archaeologist and paleontologist's paradise, but not even the most renowned professor at the University of Mantle knew everything about the place. After all, no one had managed to dig up the perfect brownish crystal-like structure buried under a mile below the surface of Vacuo's border desert. Regardless, someone digging that one up or another of the other 8 dotted around Remnant would have revolutionized the scientific community to the point where it would never be the same again. The origins of humanity would have been questioned, as well as the physiological question on what it meant to be human. Nevertheless, no one alive on Remnant had been privy to the cocoon's whereabouts or even that it existed at all, so the container's resident was allowed to sleep underneath the sands for eons, never once being disrupted from the rest he had been so deprived of before. One day, millions of years after he first went dormant, Gaara's cocoon began to crack. It would be another few million years after that point, but over the course of that time, it slowly began to crack more and more, began getting weaker and more transparent. Finally, at the height of the current human civilization, Gaara's chakra cocoon gave way completely to age and weakness, shattering completely while still in its underground burial. Exposed to the sand and dirt of the outside jolted Gaara's mind from its epoch-long slumber. His brain slowly but surely regained mental faculties after being dormant for so long. Sand. He had spent his entire life surrounded by the stuff that he shouldn't have even noticed it was present now, but for some reason, when he cracked his eyes open to get nothing but darkness and the feeling of sediment, he felt that it was something that he had been deprived of for so long. He was thirsty. He was never thirsty, but the tingling in his throat of the dry, scratchy feeling of sandpaper practically begging him for the life-giving liquid of water. The redhead had no idea where he was or what he had been doing before. He could have said he had fallen asleep, but the concept was so foreign to him. It was ridiculous. Even that wouldn't explain why he would be underground. No sight of his siblings or village. He tested his voice, the unusual vocal cords giving out a pathetic rambling of a wheeze and a hack. His faithful gourd had followed him into the chakra shell, still filled to the brim with pristine sand that had been untouched for the past epoch. The cork popped off the end of the gourd, allowing his special sand to flow out. He moved it against the other sand and minerals in his way, noting the pull of gravity wanting to push the flow of sand down. The surface must have been in the opposite direction, so he pushed back against it, creating an underground river of sand flowing upwards up to the surface, the sand at his rear pushing Gar along. A hole opened at the surface in the middle of the vacuum desert, miles away from a border town and hence civilization. A nearby coyote went up and sniffed the tiny hole curiously before there came a loud booming noise with the hole in the sand widening. The confused canine yelped and jumped back, the sudden event spooking the animal away. Gara gasped for breath as his red mop popped out of the hole first, followed by the rest of his head and then his body. The adolescent former killer groaned before crying out in pain and shutting his eyes. The light of the sun was beating down on his retina, unused for millions of years and accustomed to the dark. Gar closed his dark-circled eyes and recoiled from the sensory overload his thoughts and visions swimming every time he attempted to open his eyes. His brain throbbed, but slowly and surely his vision began to adjust. Rubbing circles on his head, the overpowered genin finally felt it tolerable enough to open his eyes and bathe in the sunlight. The itchy jinchuriki had been focused on getting his bearings out of the hole, but now that he could think about more complex matters such as his current location. To the average untrained civilian of Suna, the desert before him would have held no difference from the Kaze no Kuni. They would have fallen asleep in the desert, woken up, and concluded they were still at home judging from this view. Gara was not a civilian. Gara knew deserts. He lived and breathed sand. He was the incarnation of sand itself, and it was an instinctive part of his life with a bond that few people could begin to understand. This desert was not the Kaze no Kuni. The sand was different. It was drier and not as pure. There were certain contaminants in the sand that were not present in the Kaze no Kuni, probably the result of big business or technological innovation. On a more obvious note, there was also the matter of That, of course, referred to the giant two-headed snake that had emerged from the desert sands. With one black head and one white head, the snake hissed menacingly at Gara as it began circling around him, convinced in its mind that it had easy prey in a human boy. Gara didn't even blink at the snake's sudden appearance, but at least it was another warning bell that he wasn't in Casas anymore, or the Kaze no Kuni for that matter. The white head coiled around him. Gara blinked as the black head moved it in the opposite direction, the two halves of the snake's body forming a barrier. Like the twins that they were, they stopped in sync once they trapped Gara, both lunging at him at the same time, with their mouths open and their fangs outstretched. The snakes gave a pinned hiss and shriek as Gara's reliable sand shield immediately came to his head, their heads bouncing off the shield as if it were made of brick. The snake shook its two heads, hissing in anger, as would anyone who just struck a brick wall with their skull. On pure animal instinct, they changed their strategy after they realized that ramming a head on and biting the human would not work. With that in mind, it began to coil around its prey tighter and tighter with the intent of constricting Gara to the point where he would be completely at the snake's mercy. Gara didn't react any further as the snake's body wrapped around his sand shield, gripping it tightly before squeezing. This would have turned him into a bloody mess, shield or no. Nevertheless, all the snake was left with was a pile of sand, and Gara was left to rise from the desert a few feet away, well out of the coil trap and reach of the giant snake. A Sunabunshin was more than enough to fool a clearly mindless beast like this one. With his arms crossed, the Shukaku Jinchuriki emerged on a torrent of sand. The redhead blinked once before drawing his hands together into a seal. This beast was a fool for attempting to fight him in the desert, drawing sand both from the gourd and the desert around him. A waterfall of sand surrounded the snake, the hands jutsu of Gara's being necessary for a creature of its size. Urusa Bakuru. The snake's twin heads hissed in pain and indignation as the sand engulfed and buried them, a fresh layer of the substance being added to the desert. The sand fell over the landscape like a blanket, but Gara wasn't done yet. He put his hands down on the fresh layer of sand, channeling his chakra through the sand to create a shockwave to pass through the top layer of the sand. Sabaku Tauso. With the coffin and funeral set, the snake's hissing came to a deadly quiet as its life was snuffed out by the sand. Sand gathered around the tip of Gara's gourd, the cork settling itself in place once more. The battle was easy, but the appearance of a thing like that raised more questions than answers for Gaara. He had never seen anything like it in his life. The two-headed snake with the red eyes and the mask-like material on its face. The boy's eye scanned the landscape. Behind him was nothing but desert as far as the eye could see. But to the east there appeared a mountain range and a distant palette of green that indicated the desert would turn to forest in that direction. This land did not seem to be the constant Nukundi, but Gaara would get no answers merely hovering around in the middle of nowhere. Perhaps there would be human civilization closer to that mountain range. Slowly and calmly, the jinchuriki set off in that direction, unknowingly heading to one of the border towns. Mistral. On the other side of the world, the swamps of Mistral provided a much different environment than the dry, sandy desert on the border of Vacuo and Bale, teeming with alligators, giant insects, and grim all of a kind. Another paleontological marvel lay deep beneath the bog, far underneath the silt and mud. Like Gaara, it had weathered all kinds of weather, erosion, and even climate change, never moving. The blond boy contained inside never woke from his near-eternal slumber, even as his habitat changed from a village to a forest to a swamp over the course of eons. At the exact same time as Gaara in the desert, Naruto's underground cocoon began to crack. End of Chapter 1.